Ezra chapter 9. Ezra 9. We're going to be wrapping up the book of Ezra this evening. As we get started here in the book of Ezra chapter 9, we want to go through and review our outline as we've done each week of the book of Ezra. It divides itself into two major sections based on the fact that two of the three returns are recorded in this book. The first 6 chapters are dealing with the first return that takes place under Zerubbabel, and then the rebuilding of the temple after that return. That's the return to restore Judah as a nation. That's the one where the temple's rebuilt. Then, down the road, we have the return that takes place under Ezra, beginning in chapter 7 and going through chapter 10. That's the return that has to do more with the spiritual problems and dealing with the spiritual problems that Israel has, or Judah has, and bringing them back to the law and back to service of God. That's the section we began last week. That's the section we're still in tonight. So we're going to be dealing with chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra and dealing with really the problems that are being faced in that day and time. Now, as we come into chapter 9, I want us to think about something real quick as we've set the background of what's taken place. The first 2 chapters, dealing with the return under Ezra, dealt mostly with the journey and with the background before the return took place. So, into chapter 7, there's where we have the letter that was sent to Ezra in chapter 7. We're introduced to him in the first 10 verses. Then chapter 7, Artaxerxes sent him a letter. And that's the bulk of chapter 7. And then the end of that, we see Ezra's response to the letter. And then chapter 8 is where we have that return taking place. And it lists those returning and talks about their return. And it ends with them coming into Jerusalem at the end of chapter 8. But now in chapter 9, this is really what Ezra's having to deal with the people. And that is, there's some problems in the land. There's some problems with the Jews. In particular, there's what problem? Intermarriage. They're intermarrying with the people of the land. And that's the problem that's dealt with in chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is where the problem is first coming introduced. And the fact that here's this problem that's been going on. Chapter 10 is going to be dealing with that problem. And a list of those who were involved in it had to deal with and repent of that sin. But now let's start with chapter 9. And the first 2 verses is just where the problem is stated. Look at verses 1 and 2. When these things were done, the leaders came to me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with respect to the abominations of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed is mixed with the peoples of those lands. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers has been foremost in this trespass. So as we come in verses 1 and 2, it's brought up to Ezra. There's those that come to Ezra and tell him, there is this problem where the people, the Jews, are marrying those of the land. He lists there those that it is, the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and so on, and so forth through that list, that here are those right here in the land, the people are intermarrying with them. But not only are the people intermarrying with them, who do they specifically mention when they come to him? When the leaders came to him, who do they specifically mention? The priests and the Levites. It's not just that the people that just your regular Jew that you pass throughout are marrying those who are of these descendants, those of the world, those that are of all of these nations. It's not just those that are doing it, but it's the leaders of the people. It's the priests, it's the Levites. In fact, look at the end of verse 2. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and rulers has been what? Foremost in this trespass. It's not just that this problem taking place is being done by the common Jew, but the leaders and the religious leaders are the ones that are taking in this. So no wonder that everybody else is following along. When the religious leaders are setting that kind of example, the people are bound to follow. But now remember that the people have been commanded, under the old law not to intermarry with the people of the land. That's why it's such a severe problem as we come into these chapters here, that this intermarriage is taking place, is the fact that God has commanded them not to intermarry, and now they've come and they make the point that they've taken some of their daughters as wives so that the holy seed is mixed with the people of those lands. The very thing they've been commanded not to do is what's being done here. And the leaders come to Ezra and they tell Ezra, here's what's taking place. But I want us to focus on the latter half of this chapter, which really is just Ezra's response. There are two main portions to this, but 3 through 15 is Ezra's response to the people's sin. Verses 3 and 4 is where he tears his clothes. So when I heard this thing, I tore my garments and my robe, and plucked out some of the hairs of my head and beard, and sat down astonished. Then everyone who trembled at the words of the God of Israel assembled to me, because of the transgression of those who had been carried away captive. And I sat astonished until the evening sacrifice. So here he sits, as this is going on in verse 3, what's his reaction when he hears the problem and the sin of the people? Absolutely, he goes into mourning. That's his reaction. That should tell us something about the severity of sin and what's going on with these people. That Ezra's reaction. So when I heard this thing, I tore my garments. It seems like here he hears the people are marrying with those of the land. And the leaders are the ones that are foremost in this. And here he tears his clothes and he's weeping. There's a problem with the people of the land and their spiritual condition because they're not following the commandment of God. And Ezra's response is a response of weeping for the condition the people are in. That ought to be our reaction today when we see people in sin. Is we ought to have a reaction like Ezra, where there's this sorrow that takes place over the sin of somebody else. When somebody that is close to us, or when a brother or sister in Christ is caught up in sin, we ought to be sorrowful for the fact that their soul is lost, for their spiritual condition, just as Ezra was, as he tears his clothes here. But now beginning at verse 5, and going through the end of this chapter, is where there's a prayer by Ezra. Look beginning at verse 5. At the evening, sacrifice, I arose from my fasting, and having torn my garment and my robe, I fell on my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God. And I said, Oh my God, I am too ashamed and humiliated to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has grown up to the heavens. Since the days of our fathers to this day, we have been very guilty. And for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been delivered into the hands of the kings of the land to the sword, to captivity and to plunder and to humiliation, as it is this day. And now for a little while, grace, verse 8, has been shown from the Lord our God to leave us a remnant to escape and to give us a peg in this holy place, that our God may enlighten our eyes and give us a measure of revival in our bondage. For we were slaves, yet our God did not forsake us in our bondage, but He extended mercy to us in the sight of the kings of Persia to revive us, to repair the house of our God, to rebuild its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. And now, O our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you command by your servants the prophets, saying, The land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land, with the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, with their abominations which have filled it from one end to the other with their impurity. Now therefore, do not give your daughters as wives for their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat good of the land. Eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, since you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and have given us such deliverance as this, should we again break your commandments and join in marriage with the people committing these abominations? Would you be angry with us until you had consumed us, so that there would be no remnant or survivor? O Lord our God, you are righteous, for we are left out as a remnant, as it is this day. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can stand before you because of this. And as Ezra gives this prayer here, and he goes back, he points out in verse 6 and 7, he says, I'm too ashamed and humiliated to lift my face, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, our guilt has grown up to the heavens. He pointed up in verse 7, we have been very guilty. As the people stand here in this present condition, this condition of sin, this condition of breaking God's commandments, he points out that they're very guilty. He points out how great their sin is. But then he goes through and he points out in these verses the fact that their fathers had been guilty of sin and disobeyed the commandment of God. And as you look through these verses here, he points out that those people that are now in sin are a remnant of what once was. Here was this nation that once was that had been caught up in sin, caught up in all these trespasses, and God had had them taken away into Babylonian captivity. And there's a remnant that is left after all that has been taking place. And he makes the point as he goes throughout this chapter, that yet our God, verse 9, did not forsake us in our bondage, but He extended mercy to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to revive us, to repair the house of our God, to rebuild its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. In spite of all the sin that had taken place before, prior to the captivity, he's pointing out, after all of that, God still showed His mercy and allowed a remnant to return to Jerusalem. And so here they are reviving this nation, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city, rebuilding the walls. Here are the people that should have understood the mercy that God has shown to them. Here are the people that should be the ones that are living the most for God, having seen this mercy. And what do we see them doing? They're guilty of sin. Those that have been shown the mercy of God, those that had returned, those that should have known best of all, of God's mercy and the fact that He punished them, had gone back to sin just like those who had gone into captivity before. And he's pointing that out here in these chapters. He pointed out in verse 10, for we have forsaken your commandments which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land, with the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, with their abominations which have filled it from one end to the other with their impurity. So that's what the Lord says about the people of the land. He said then in verse 12, now therefore, do not give your daughters as wives for their sons, nor take their daughters to your sons. And never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. The leaving it as an inheritance to their children is conditional on the fact that they're following God's commandments, one of which was not to intermarry with the people of the land, and not to partake with the people of the land and in their abominations. And after all that has come upon us, he said in verse 13, for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, since you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve. The punishment, Ezra points out, for all that's taken place and all that the people have done, yes, they were punished, but he points out, what you punished us was less than what our iniquities deserved, he said in verse 13. And you've given us such a great deliverance, he pointed out in verse 13. Should we again break your commandments? Again, that's what he's coming back to. After all that's taken place, here we are again, and the people are breaking the commandments and joining in marriage with these people, committing these abominations. The abominations they're not supposed to be partaking in. That's what the people they're marrying are taking in. Remember when God gave them the old law that He called upon them to be holy? Put a marker, keep your finger here in Ezra. But remember in the book of Leviticus, as the law was originally given, what God commands them to be. Remember at the end of Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus 11 is a chapter in which God is dealing with which Moses is telling them here, what they can and cannot eat, what's clean and what's unclean. And when it comes to the end of the chapter in Leviticus 11:45, it says, for I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. God says they need to be a holy people, just as He is holy. Look over in Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus 19. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, verse 1 and 2, Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. No, they're to be holy. They're set up to be set apart. They're to be different. That's what they're called upon to be. Chapter 11 again, where that first occurred, is the context in which he's talking about what's clean and unclean. And the people of the lands may eat what they want to eat, and they may not worry about what they think is clean and unclean. But here's the command from God, and remember, you're set apart, you're different. Chapter 18 of Leviticus, just prior to the command of 19. Chapter 18 is dealing with sexual sins. Over in chapter 20, he's talking about penalties for breaking the law. Chapter 19, he comes through and he's dealing with all these things. He follows it up by telling them they shall revere their mother and father and keep the Sabbath and not turn to idols and offer a sacrifice as a peace offering. Again, back in chapter 18, just prior to this, he told them not to defile themselves with any of these things. And you go throughout that chapter and all that took place. He opened chapter 18 by telling them that they should not do according to those of the land of Egypt, according to those of the land of Canaan, that He is bringing them out of. The problem was the people then did those things. They did the same things the people of the land did. And now, after they've returned, they're marrying those people. Remember, He told them in Leviticus not to do the things of the land of Egypt of which they had come out, and not to follow those of the land of Canaan. Now go back to chapter 9 of Ezra, and look again at verse 1. Look again at verse 1. Remember those that He told them in the law not to be like. He told them to be holy, to be set apart, be different. He told them in chapter 18 not to follow the Egyptians, not to be like those in Egypt or Canaan, those in the land of Canaan. Which, by the way, is the list of people we're fixing to read. But follow along and see what all is listed here. The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands. So that's the very thing that they were told to do. With respect to the abominations of, listen to the list, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. The very people that God told them not to be anything like, those are the people they're marrying. Those are the people the leaders of the day refer to in verse 2, that they were marrying so that the holy seed is mixed with the peoples of the land. And Ezra's prayer here at the end of chapter 9 is him saying, listen, we've been punished less than we deserved before, and now here we are again after all the mercy you've shown us, and we're right back at breaking your law. He says, O Lord God of Israel, you are righteous, for we are left as a remnant as it is this day. Verse 15, here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can stand before you because of this. And he points out that because of all that's done, here they stand. Here the remnant that has returned stands in guilt. But now if you turn into chapter 15, continuing the same thought, chapter 15 is where we're going to be dealing with the problem now. For chapter 9 was talking about the problem. Chapter 10, now we're dealing with the problem. But look at verse 1. Now while Ezra was praying and while he was confessing, weeping, and bowing down before the house of God, a very large assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him from Israel. So during the time that he's still praying, at the time of chapter 14, while he's still in this prayer, this is when the people come to him. Now the chapter here is going to divide into 4 major sections. There is a confession that takes place, 2 of them actually, verses 1 to 4, and also verses 9 to 16. There's 2 different times there's confession made by people. 5 and 6, they make an oath. 7 and 8, they make a proclamation to gather the people together because of the oath that was made. That's when that second confession takes place with all the people. And then finally it ends with the separation of those who have married with the people of the land, separating from their foreign wives. But I want us to begin now in verse 2. We saw verse 1, they came to him. I want you to look at verse 2. And Shachaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, spoke up and said to Ezra, we have trespassed against our God and have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land. Yet now there is hope in Israel in spite of this. Now therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and those who have been born to them, according to the advice of my master and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God. And let it be done according to the law. Arise, for this matter is your responsibility. We also are with you. Be of good courage and do it. Now, as you look here in verse 2, as Shachaniah comes to him, he makes this statement, we have trespassed against our God and have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land. So as he comes and makes this confession, he acknowledges, we've trespassed against God for what has taken place here. Here are the sins that we're in. He says, we've trespassed against God. Now, I want you to notice something for just a second. Who is the father of Shachaniah? Jehiel. Turn over to verse 26. Turn over to verse 26. Beginning of verse 18, it says, and among the sons of the priests who had taken pagan wives, the following were found. And then it starts listing all of those who've taken pagan wives. Now look at verse 26. Of the sons of Elam, Madani, Zechariah, and who? Jehiel. So you flip over here, here's Shachaniah who says we've trespassed, and his father is one of the ones guilty of sin. Think about this for a second. Here's something that's hitting close to home in what's taking place, and that doesn't matter, that it hits close to home. He still acknowledges that what the people have done is wrong. They are guilty of sin. We have trespassed against our God and have taken pagan wives from the people of the land. But now I want you to think about the end of his statement in verse 2. He says we've trespassed. And he confessed what it was they had trespassed by. But how does he end verse 2? And yet there is hope in Israel. In spite of this. In spite of the fact that the people have partaken in sin. In spite of the fact that the people have broken the commandment of God. By the way, when you flip to the end of chapter 10 and read 18 through 43, and you read the long list of those partaking in it, it's not like here's a few people over here and a few people over here that are in sin. It's a lot of people in this problem of sin. It's a widespread problem. And yet, despite the fact that there's a problem of sin, and the problem is very widespread, Shachaniah says that there is hope in Israel in spite of this. Look at verse 3. Now therefore let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and those who have been born to them. Here's what Shachaniah says. There's hope in Israel. There's hope in Israel because they can end the sin. Verse 3. He said that they needed to make a covenant with God to put away all the foreign wives and those who had been born to them. Well, what was the sin? The sin was marrying those foreign wives. The solution was to put them away. The solution to the problem that was taking place here was the sin needed to cease. That's what had to happen for the sin to stop. The sin needed to cease. But not only did the sin need to cease, it needed to cease quickly. Now, therefore, let us make a covenant. They didn't wait. He didn't say, let's wait and tomorrow come and make a covenant. He said, now, therefore. In light of what's taking place now, right now, let's make a covenant. Verse 4, arise, for this matter is your responsibility. And we are with you. Be of good courage and do it. In verse 4. As he looks at Ezra and he says, arise, for this is your responsibility. For Ezra to go and Ezra to talk to the people and educate the people. Shachaniah doesn't tell Ezra there to wait and tomorrow we'll go talk to the people. Wait and go a little bit longer. He tells him right then, arise. They needed to fix the problem. They needed to end the sin, but they needed to do it sooner rather than later. They didn't need to delay dealing with the sin. He pointed out that they needed to put them away, verse 3, according to the advice of my master and those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done according to the law. Now, why would there be those trembling at the commandment of God? Why would one here in this case of Ezra 9 and 10 be trembling at the commandment of God? When they realize they're in sin, they're going to tremble at the commandment of God. They've got to realize now that they're in sin and there's consequences to sin. Ezra pointed that out in his prayer in chapter 9. That they had been punished, though he said far less than what they really and truly deserved. And here he said they stand before him now. He made the point, and, as he goes through and talks about the fact that as they've continued to do that, would you not be angry with us until you have consumed us in chapter 9, verse 14, so that there would be no remnant or a survivor? Ezra points out back in chapter 9 and verse 14, is would you be angry with us to the point that the remnant that still is even destroyed? For their sin. The people need to realize they're in sin. The people have realized that, and the people now need to realize it needs to be dealt with. They realize that, and now they tremble because they're in sin. And as long as they continue in sin, there's going to be consequences to that. And so the people tremble at the commandment of God. The solution is to let it be done according to the law. What the law says, that's what needs to be done. That is the solution to the problem. Shachaniah says that we have trespassed against our God, yet now there is hope in Israel in spite of this. There is hope because they can change. There is hope because they realize they need to change. And they can turn back and do according to the commandment. And there's hope because they can still do according to the commandment of God. Now, verse 5. Then Ezra arose and made the leaders of the priests, the Levites, and all Israel swear an oath that they would do according to this word. So they swore an oath. Then Ezra rose up from before the house of God and went into the chamber of Jehoiakim, the son of Elishib. And when he came there, he ate no bread and drank no water, for he mourned because of the guilt of those from the captivity. Again, Ezra, here in this case, where he's made them make this oath that they'll do according to what was said in the previous verses. And those there swear an oath in verse 5. And after that he arises, he goes to the house. And here he still mourns because of the guilt of the people. He still mourns for the guilt of those from the captivity. They're still in sin. You see, they now realize, here's something important we need to realize. They now realize there's a problem. Shachaniah admitted that, and there were those with him who came with him. There were those who swore an oath they would do according to that. But you know what hasn't happened yet? They haven't actually dealt with it yet. They may realize their sin, but it hasn't been dealt with yet. Here's an important lesson for us. Just because we acknowledge sin and we acknowledge a need for change doesn't constitute change and doesn't mean we're in a right relationship, not till that actually takes place. That's not going to happen until we get down to verse 18. So they're still mourning. People are in a lost condition. The change hasn't happened yet. So they issued in verse 7 a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the descendants of the captivity that they must gather at Jerusalem, and that whoever should not come within 3 days, according to the instructions of the leaders and the elders, all his property would be confiscated, and he himself would be separated from the assembly of those from the captivity. Now look at verse 9. Beginning of verse 9, we have coming back to our first point, the confession. This is that second grouping of verses where confession takes place. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered at Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th of the month. And all the people sat in the open square of the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. They're trembling for 2 reasons. Number 1, they're in sin. Number 2, there's heavy rain. By the way, this tells me something of the importance of dealing with sin. Is they didn't look out and say, you know what, it's rainy today, let's wait till tomorrow and we're going to deal with the problem then. They dealt with the problem even in the heavy rain and gathered in the square. That tells me something of the importance that even though these are uncomfortable conditions, they're dealing with the sin now. Pick back up at verse 9. Verse 10. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have transgressed and have taken pagan wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do His will. Separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the pagan wives. See, some people had already confessed there was a problem back at the beginning of the chapter. But there are others still who haven't made acknowledgement of their sin. There are others still who still had to confess. Others who haven't acknowledged what they're doing wrong yet. Some of the people are aware of that. But there were others, as they gathered them all together, that they needed to realize what they've done is sin. And Ezra looks at them and tells them, listen, what you've done is you've transgressed, and you've taken the wives, and you've added to the guilt of Israel. He tells them they need to make confession, acknowledge the fact they've sinned, to do the Lord's will, and to separate themselves from the pagan wives. Now listen to the reaction of the people. Then all the assembly answered and said with a loud voice, yes, as you have said, so we must do. But there are many people. It is the season for heavy rain, and we are not able to stand outside, nor is this the work of 1 or 2 days, for there are many of us who have transgressed in this matter. Please let the elders of our entire assembly stand, and let all in our cities who have taken pagan wives come at appointed times, together with the elders and judges of their cities, until the fierce wrath of our God is turned away from us in this matter. Only Jonathan the son of Asiel and Haziah the son of Tikvah opposed this. Meshullam and Shabbatai the Levite gave them support. Then the descendants of the captivity did so. And Ezra the priest, with certain heads of the fathers' households, were set apart by the fathers' households, each of them by name. And they sat down on the first day of the 10th month to examine the matter. By the first day of the first month, they had finished questioning all the men who had taken pagan wives. So here the people have come to acknowledge this, as Ezra tells them, you need to make confession. You need to separate from your wives. You need to do the will of God. They said, yes, as you have said, so we must do. Yes, they're in sin. Yes, they acknowledge they need to make a change. And they come up with a plan here to do that, as there's so many people in sin. It's not like they could just deal with this like they could come to them and come to the leaders and come to Ezra and deal with it real quickly. He points out that there are many of us at the end of verse 13 who have transgressed in this matter. There's so many in sin. But they need to deal with it, as they point out that they needed to come together with the elders and judges of the cities, verse 15, or at the end of verse 14, until the fierce wrath of our God is turned away from us in this matter. They've come to the end of verse 14, and then he realized they need to deal with their sin because the fierce wrath of God is upon them, and they need to deal with the sin so that can be turned away concerning this matter. They need to deal with their sin. Now I want you to pick up in verse 18. Beginning at verse 18 is just a long list of names, but I want us to read through this and just to understand the long list of names. How many people have been engaged in the sin here in Israel? And among the sons of the priests who had taken pagan wives, the following were found. Of the sons of Jeshua, the son of Jezadok, and his brothers, Maaseiah, Eleazar, Jarib, and Gedaliah. And they gave their promise that they would put away their wives. And being found guilty, they presented a ram of the flock as their trespass offering. Also of the sons of Emer, Hanani, and Zebediah. Of the sons of Haram, Messiah, Elijah, Shemaiah, Jehiel, and Uzziah. Of the sons of Pashur, Elianiah, Messiah, Ishmael, Nethanel, Jozabad, and Elasiah. And of the Levites, Jozabad, Shimei, Keliah, the same as Kilitai, Pethahiah, Judah, and Eleazar. Also of the singers, Elishab, and of the gatekeepers, Shalom, Tiliam, and Uri. And others of Israel, of the sons of Parosh and Ramai, Jezahiah, Malachi, Mijamim, Eleazar, Malchijah, and Benai. Of the sons of Elam, Mattaniah, Zechariah, Jehiel, Abadiah, Jeremoth, and Eliah. Of the sons of Zatu, Elianiah, Elishab, Mattaniah, Jeremoth, Zabed, and Azaziah. Of the sons of Babai, Jehanan, Hananiah, Zabai, and Athli. Of the sons of Bani, Meshullam, Malachah, Abadiah, Jashub, Shelai, and Ramoth. Of the sons of Pahath, Moab, Adonai, Chilal, Benaniah, Masai, Mattaniah, Bezalel, Benu, and Manasseh. Of the sons of Haram, Eleazar, Ishajaz, and Malajaz, Shimei, Shimeon, Benjamin, Malach, and Shemarai. Of the sons of Hashem, Mattaniah, Mattatiah, Zabed, Eliphelet, Jeremiah, Manasseh, and Shimei. Of the sons of Bani, Madai, Amram, Uel, Benaniah, Bediah, Shelah, Bani, Merath, Elishab, Mattaniah, Jehisha, Bani, Benu, Shimei, Shilmai, Nathan, Adiah, Macnabiah, Sheshai, Sariah, Azrael, Shilamai, Shiramai, Shalom, Amariah, and Joseph. Of the sons of Nebo, Jehiel, Mattaniah, Zabad, Zemanah, Jedediah, Joel, and Beni. That's a long list of names of people that have been engaged in this sin. Now you begin to see when the people came to make confession, they said that it's going to take a while because there's many of them. That long list of names of people, these are the people engaged in the sin. Again, as I said before, this is not something that there's a few people here and a few people there. This is a widespread problem to have all of these people, beginning at verse 19 or verse 18 and going through verse 43 to give a list of names with several names per verse, just gives you an idea of how many people there are. And all these, verse 44, had taken pagan wives. And some of them had wives by whom they had children. Every one of these had taken pagan wives. And of this long list, not only had they all taken pagan wives, some of them even had children. I want you to go back to the beginning of chapter 10. Shachaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the sons of Elam, verse 2, spoke up and said to Ezra, "We have trespassed against our God and have taken pagan wives from the peoples of the land. Yet now there is hope in Israel in spite of this. Now therefore let us make a covenant with our God too." And what does he say they need to do? Put away all these wives and what? Those who have been born to them. You think about this long list of those that have put away their wives, and some of these have children now they have nothing to do with, as they've realized the fact that here are people that have been living in sin, and they needed to end the sin. Here's something I learned in the book of Ezra. Sin needs to be dealt with, no matter how difficult it is. You think it was difficult for the people here in the book of Ezra to deal with the sin? To put away their pagan wives? Some of them would have been married for probably quite some length of time. They have these children born by them, they now have put away, as Shechaniah pointed out, they needed to back in verse 3. You think that would have been difficult? But you know what the response of the people was? Yes, verse 12, as you have said, so we must do. If they wanted to turn away the wrath of God, and as they pointed out in verse 14, was currently upon them, they needed to follow these instructions to put away these pagan wives. And the people, understanding the condition they were in, understanding their need to get out of that relationship because they're now in sin, said, yes, as you have said, so we must do. And they did. Here's another important lesson to learn from the people of Ezra's day. We already talked about the fact that acknowledging sin isn't enough to deal with sin. Acknowledging that sin needs to be dealt with isn't enough to deal with sin. There's action that has to take place. And they did it, no matter how difficult. Now, they didn't just say, oh, we're going to take care of it. We'll take care of our sin. They actually followed through. They did what they said they were going to do. And in doing that, verse 15 of chapter 10, they wanted to turn the fierce wrath of God. They said they were going to do this until the fierce wrath of God is turned away from us in this matter. And now, as they have confessed the fact that they had sinned, they had repented of that. No matter how difficult it was, they took care of it. Here's what I learned. That when that takes place, we turn away the fierce wrath of God. And that's what the people did here. By having dealt with the sin, they were going to do it until the fierce wrath of God was turned away from them. And now, having done it, the fierce wrath of God has been turned away. Now, we've gone through that rather quickly. through these two chapters. I want us to think about some practical lessons and some practical application of this. There's no commandment today that says Christians can't marry non-Christians. Now, we can talk about whether that's wise or not, but there's not a command specifically given. But there's a lot of lessons, though, in this chapter we can learn, particularly about dealing with sin. As we go through these two chapters, there's a lot of things we can learn. What are some practical lessons we see here in chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra? Absolutely. You're right. Sometimes to be pleasing to Him, you have to make those difficult decisions. And that's exactly what these people did, was made that difficult decision. And we need to ask ourselves if we're willing to make the difficult decisions that might have to be made in service to God. What else do we see? Absolutely, you're right. People in verse 15 that opposed the idea, you're right, that some of them opposed it, yet the people still carried through with it, even though some didn't think it was fair. And you're right, they had to carry that out even though they didn't think it was fair. They had to follow God's command. Here's a lesson we learn. We must acknowledge Him before we can deal with it. The people were caught up in sin, and they needed to get out of that. But they couldn't get out of their sin until they acknowledged the fact that they realized they were in sin. I want you to think about what Ezra told them in verses 10 and 11. He said that they had transgressed, they had taken pagan wives, and they had added to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession to the Lord, God of our fathers, and do His will. And separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from your pagan wives. Before they could do His will, and they needed to do that separation from the pagan wives, they needed to acknowledge the fact they'd sinned. They needed to realize they were in sin. They can't deal with the problem of sin if they don't realize that that sin is there. They had to realize that to deal with it. I see in this chapter how we should react to sin. I see that in Ezra. Somebody that sees his brethren in sin, who mourns for their sin and who prays because of their sin. And then when the opportunity presents itself, he confronts them and helps them deal with their sin to make sure they came back to a relationship that was pleasing to God. We need to have the attitude that we'll mourn the sins of others. We mourn our own sins, but we mourn the sins of others. We should pray that they see that they realize the condition they're in. And we need to confront them if that need be, let them realize, hey, you need to make some change. Let them know we're there for them and help them in any way we can. I realize the sin must be put away. He didn't tell them, hey, you've sinned. Acknowledge the fact you've sinned and go home to your pagan wives. But they had to put away their pagan wives. That was the sin, and the sin had to be put away. Realizing they were in sin and acknowledging the fact they're in sin doesn't do any good if they go right back to the sin. Sin must be put away. And I realize that even when sin hits close to home, we must deal with it. That's where it can get difficult, is when sin starts hitting close to home. It's difficult to deal with, and it can be. But I want you to remember this, that Shachaniah pointed out that they had sinned, and his own father was one of the ones in sin. There are those that left their pagan wives and their children because they realized they were in sin. Even when it hits close to home, we must deal with sin. Next week, we'll begin the book of Nehemiah, and Donnie will take over teaching in Nehemiah.